Okay, I'm Lydinyda Nacpil. I'm from the Philippines and I work with the Asian People's Movement on Death and Development. And we're also part of a bigger network called the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice.
And what is the big climate movement in the Philippines called, for example?
We have actually several networks working on climate. We belong to the group called the Philippine Movement for Climate Justice. It's a relatively new formation. It was only started 7 years ago, just also around the time that the global climate justice movement was emerging and building itself.
And what does it do? What is the struggle about?
Well, we engage in three levels: local, national, and also international. At the local level, we help strengthen the fights of local communities against dirty energy and also push for the promotion of renewable energy. But renewable energy that is under the control of people and communities, because there's also some push for renewable energy that is under corporate control. So basically the same kind of system which we have for the current system where it's controlled by corporations.
Why is this important? Why is it important that people control?
Well, because we believe that if unless energy control of energy is made more democratic, then what will happen even under a renewable energy system is that a big majority of our people will not have access. It's not just simply what type of energy, it has to be energy that serves the people, the communities, their basic needs. Right now, the energy system that we have is mainly geared towards furnishing the demands of corporations. For instance, a lot of the expansion of new energy plants, which are mostly coal based energy, is geared to follow the expansion of the mining industry in the Philippines. So it's very important for us, not just what kind of energy, but how it is managed and controlled.
And what is it like for a villager, say? What can they begin to do when there is a huge corporation? And is it also the governing structure?
Well, we are up against many things. One of that is, of course, the national energy policy of the government. No, here at the COP, of course, we welcome the fact that the Philippine delegation was very much behind the push for the 1.5-degree goal, and also for the push for renewable energy and decarbonization by the year 2050. But we wish that were really the wholehearted policy of the national government. It is very much in contradiction, for instance, with the plan of the national government to set up more than 50 new coal power plants. Even as it is increasing its support for renewable energy, the clear priority is still for coal power.
Why is that? Why is that? Why are they pushing?
There are several things. One is that there's powerful interest behind the push for the coal industry, not just locally, but also internationally. There are some of the big, powerful elite families are invested in the coal industry. Secondly, the government is also buying very much into this hype about coal being a cheap kind of energy, and it is cheap if you're only considering the upfront costs, if you're not considering the environmental, the health, and the social costs to the communities. So it's taking the easy way out because, after all, its main priority is to provide cheap energy for the companies, for the corporations, and not really for communities. So we're fighting against that, even as we're fighting against the corporations themselves, because the corporations are not just a very powerful lobby vis-a-vis the government. They're very much, very much intertwined with the politicians and the families that are controlling government. The Philippines, like in many countries, I would say most countries, not just countries of the South, economic interests and political interests are really very much married with each other. No?
What about the media? Does the media act for the people, or is the media also intertwined?
Well, largely, of course, that because media is controlled by corporations, that's we are also very much against media that is more partial to the truth, that serves the interests of the elites. But of course, since we've had a long history of democratic movement, we struggled against Marcos. We have also built a strong culture for freedom of the press, and there has, there is some kind of way that media corporations also have to maintain that. So we do manage to get a lot of our stories out, but of course not with as much space as the mainstream narrative. There's also some kind of like unique situations where some members of the powerful media corporations or families who control the corporations are in fact environmentalists. So we do get some of our stories out with their support.
So tell me, what is it really like for a family, say, living in a rural area who has no power? And what do they do? What happens?
Well, families in the rural areas are up against so much, before they can even think about energy or different types of energy, or even at some point a few years ago, even before they can think about the environment or climate change, the first struggle is to really survive, to put food on the table. And that struggle isn't so much only because of the struggle because they are poor and they have no resources. It's also because there are active forces in their communities that are controlling resources. There's the landlord, who's very much often also the local politician, who's also tied up with the corporations that actually buy the crops from the production of these the lands where they live. So it's a constant struggle against these powerful forces, and it's the same forces that you find control the political infrastructures locally and nationally oftentimes. Then, a few years ago, climate change was no longer simply an environmental issue. It's very much an issue of survival for many of the communities in the Philippines, when, because of climate change, we started getting hit regularly and with more frequency by super typhoons. So almost no community in the Philippines is saved from the regular specter of huge flooding, torrential rains, crops being destroyed in the rural areas, in the cities, whole communities just being destroyed because their houses are swept away. So on top of all that, people in the rural areas, even in the urban poor communities, on top of all the struggles they have to do economically and even politically, now we have climate change, which is, of course, an economic and political issue as well.
So what do they do? So if I was a person like this, where would I begin?
There's usually two reactions, and well, doesn't necessarily mutually exclusive. One reaction is really to be desperately seeking means to survive. So they're very vulnerable to, how would you say, they're very vulnerable to how politicians would like to seek greater control of their lives because politicians need them for votes. No, we have elections coming up in a few weeks. But there's also, alongside of that, emerging in people's attitudes is this desire to fight back and to resist. And that is, of course, evidenced by a long history of struggles of our people. No? And more recently, like 25 years ago, it was the resistance against a dictatorship that was successful. And there's a lot of examples of struggles and resistance against particular issues like land grabbing, struggles for land reform, struggles against mining. There's a lot of very hot areas where there's huge fights and intense fights that have been going on for years against mining. And then also now on climate change, there's a lot of initiative to link up with groups that are looking at the issue of climate change, because people are waking up to the fact that it's not just an environmental issue, that it's really an issue for the survival of our people. So the Filipino communities are very keen on being part of organizations, and there's almost no community in the Philippines where no organizing has taken place. And of course, right now there's a lot of interest in linking up not just with national fights, but also international fights.
When you say fights, are these often really physical fights as well as political fights? Now, is there violence against the people who try to struggle?
We have had a long experience of militarization in the Philippines. Martial law was declared in 1972, no? And for many generations of Filipinos, including mine, we've almost had no memory of any kind of society where the military doesn't have a very strong presence and role. Even now, under so-called democratic rule, people have taken for granted that the military is very much politicized, that your rights can be taken away at any point in time. Martial law can be redeclared at any point in time. So it's very much physical in that sense, that we have to defend ourselves from actual physical repression. And it's also a long history, centuries I would say, of private armies, of landlords. They organize their own armies, especially in the rural areas, so that they do use brute force to fight against farmers who resist how they run things in the rural areas.
So are these landlords with armies, are these the warlords one hears about?
Yes, that is one way they're called the warlords. And then also you have added to this whole complicated mess, you have actually armies that were actually funded by the military at some point, that have declared independence, and now there are all sorts of different kind of private armies, especially in the south, that are operating and are threatening innocent civilians.
So it's a terrifying world to be in, where you're struggling in a life and death way, and there are so many people who are powerful on every level against you. So what can a movement like the climate justice movement, what can you do?
Actually, when we say the climate justice movement, it's also, as it happens often in the South, it's also mostly the same organizations that are fighting almost every other issue, no? Because you don't have any choice. Many issues threaten your lives, your communities. So the climate justice movement is a movement of people that are not just seeking specific changes related to these different issues, but we are seeking to transform our entire society. And that movement has also, again, its roots in the whole struggle against the dictator. We knew even then that we were not just fighting against one man and one man's authoritarian rule. We had our vision for our country, that's to build a better life for our people, to more democratic, more just. I think what the climate justice movement adds to that, or what it reflects, is the fact that we have come to realize in the last decade or so, or realize even more, that the environment and nature has to, our relationship with it has to be very much a part of that envisioning of a new order, of a new society. We probably didn't realize as much then, probably because we were facing, what seemed to us more urgent things, like when you're fighting against a dictator, it was very difficult to stop and think about, talking about other issues. Although I would say it was very much related. As a young student, I used to, I became more interested in the environment only because I was taking up biology. And these were the same people whom I met, the organizers I met, who were also actively organizing to rebuild the movement against the dictatorship at that time. Because one of the sectors very much affected by the dictator's economic policies was the environment, all the plundering of our forests. We lost a big bulk of our virgin forests during the time of the dictatorship. So I think that's what's very important about the climate justice movement. Not only does it, open up new arenas for us to fight to build a better world, it also opens up new understanding of what that world should be. That we should as much care about not only who controls, but how do we actually build our economies.
That's really great. Could you tell me something about the specific struggle with, for example, the government pushing coal and against renewables? Some example, an actual example of something that happened somewhere. And Ian was mentioning something to me last night about Mindanao, for example.
Yeah.
Some
Well, right now there are several what we call hotspots, several hotspots in the Philippines where they're planning to build coal power plants, new coal power plants, and there's a lot of organizing being done to resist this power plants. So in Mindanao there are more than 10, and we have many colleagues who are working with people on the ground to assist them in organizing the resistance to this, because people know on the ground and they resist because we have existing coal power plants and we know we have experience with these coal power plants. We know how much harm they have caused locally to the communities. So,
like what kind of harm have they caused?
well, health, for instance, no? So there has been a higher incidence of cancer in a number of these places where we have coal power plants. A number of higher incidence and worse kinds of respiratory illnesses because of the coal dust. One example also would be an impact on livelihoods and the crops there. We have an area where we have really good mangoes. No? They produce that. And now they're producing probably less than 25% of what they used to produce because of the impact of the coal power plant in that neighborhood. That's how much negative effect they have had. And that's not just counting in terms of the number of mangoes they produce. It's also the number of people whose livelihoods have already been severely impacted by that.
So when you say people know these terrible things, but the government must also know these terrible things, does it mean nothing?
They make a lot of promises, but they're not kept. And some of the new promises are the promises in terms of what they call the clean coal technology. But what we call it, that's a dirty lie. No, clean coal is a dirty lie because we know that, first of all, it's not even the state-of-the-art clean coal technology that they have in the US that they're promising to use in the Philippines. And even if they did, we also know the studies about clean coal and how it's not clean, right? But the government probably is hoping that these kinds of resistance will be highly limited to and very localized. But it's already beginning to know and understand that it cannot be, and it is not, no? Because we have a national campaign now against coal. It is supported by a wide range of citizens groups, including churches.
So when you say campaign, is it just vocal? Is it in the media? Or is it something more than words?
We have a combination of different elements to it. We have litigation. We're all set to file a case in the Supreme Court. We have actual campaigns, actual actions on the ground to stop the construction. So we have people mobilizing in different communities to stop the effort, for instance, to file a permit in the city government. Or we have had cases where people have actually stopped vehicles that are bringing equipment to these places because they want to delay or to stop completely the construction of the plants. So there's a variety of elements to this campaign. There's also media. We're trying to mobilize communities and the public that are not in this immediately affected areas for them to understand that they also have a high stake in it. All the way from how these coal plants and including coal mines will impact on water sources, fresh water sources, on coastal areas in the Philippines. So they will also be affected. plus the contribution that they will have in exacerbating the climate crisis.
Do you think that people who previously didn't have any direct experience of these injustices, say the middle classes or the elites in the urban areas, for example, do you think now that there have been these terrible typhoons and so many and so violent, these typhoons, do you think they're beginning to wake up, or are they still cut off?
I think they are beginning to wake up because we have many more people coming from the middle class and even some parts of the elite that are joining. I think the problem is not so much that they don't recognize that there is a climate crisis. The problem is more in terms of what would be the solutions, the fight for them to understand what the real solutions are. Because we understand internationally and nationally there's a lot of voices and narratives about what solutions should be, Even among the climate campaigners, I fear that we still need to do a lot of educational work, So for instance, the people that do not want to change policy comprehensively are promoting false solutions like what they used to term net zero. Net zero is a term which means they can continue to emit greenhouse gases, but they will invent all sorts of geoengineering to capture the carbon so that the net in effect is zero. And there was a lot of backlash to that. We campaigned against net zero, and in this last couple of weeks during the COP, they've come up with new words that some of the climate campaigners that don't really understand it seem to embrace it. Like, for instance, climate neutrality is a word they have used. It's in the agreement. And we know that climate neutrality is another word for net zero because we were in the rooms, we were in the debates. But unfortunately, some of our colleagues in the climate movement, some of them also calling themselves climate justice movements, I think probably quite innocently thought, this is a nice term, climate neutrality, because that means zero emissions, but you know that it's not really zero emissions. It's going to be just net zero.
And do you think that is nuclear power being pushed also?
Oh, definitely. It was funny because we used to, in the last 2 weeks, sit at an area where there was a lot of space so we could bring some tables together. Until one day we realized, because we were just so busy meeting, that we were meeting right next to a booth that was promoting nuclear power as the solution to climate change. It's exactly what was being said in their video that was running constantly. And that's not just at the international level. There are policymakers, for instance, in the Philippines that have been articulating that because they have been trying to, for a long time in the Philippines, trying to get the government to, start projects, nuclear power projects again. Because we stopped the first one, the Bataan nuclear power plant. We stopped that in the 80s. And they're, finding reasons to start it again or start some other nuclear plant somewhere else in the Philippines.
So some of our friends also in Britain who are, sincere and committed to the cause, they also argue that although nuclear power isn't great, that it's better than climate change. And therefore it's the lesser of two evils, and that we need to go that way to help climate change. What do you say to that? And that the new nuclear plants are very different to the old ones. They will be safer and so on.
It's unfortunate that people don't still realize that this is just grasping at straws. It may be true that nuclear power is not emitting the same kind of greenhouse gases, but there's a lot of other threats that nuclear power presents to us. And even with the most sophisticated technology, they still cannot tell us what are we going to do with the nuclear waste to dispose of it in eternity in a safe, 100% safe way. No, they can't answer that. So as long as they can't answer that, I don't think I would like to endanger the planet any more than it is already from all sorts of harm, because they can't address the problem of nuclear waste.
What do you feel about what happened at the COP? Do you know, many people are saying, thank goodness, it's a step, it's a wonderful step, or a small step, a big step. What do you feel about the COP?
You know, we were talking about that over breakfast yesterday, and I was trying to explain to my younger colleagues that we're probably not necessarily talking about, how do you say, some of our colleagues who are saying that there's some good things to hang on to are probably not necessarily deliberately deceiving people, because that's really how they believe it. It's probably something like a glass is 10% full and they would like to highlight the 10%, whereas for us, what is glaring is that it's 90% empty. And even that isn't quite a very complete analogy, because even the 10% that is there came at such great cost. The 10% there, I would say, is the fact that what's good about this agreement is that it introduces 1.5 as an aspirational goal, which is what a lot of people are really looking at. Because it's there, then it gives us an opportunity to now, in the coming years and months, and which is really true, in the coming months and years, an opportunity to demand of government to deliver on this 1.5. Probably another part of the 10% is the fact that in this agreement, developing countries have contributed to the targets for emissions cuts. That's a very controversial point, because some of our other colleagues still think that there should be no contribution at all, or that developing countries should not contribute at all because we were not part of the historical responsibility. But a lot has changed, and that is true from when the convention was adopted, and now there are developing countries, a number of them, that will in a few years start exceeding their share, which means will start being part of the problem. And that includes my country. In a few years, in 10 years, given the business as usual projection, we will start becoming part of the problem. And we don't want that to happen, no? And regardless of the math, it's also important that we don't follow the same dirty development pathway as the rich countries. So I think generally it's positive, as long as we are not unduly expected to be, assuming all the burden of mitigation efforts, which is the 90% that's wrong with this agreement. That even as it's good that developing countries are contributing, it's so terrible that the developed countries are doing so small compared to their share of what they should be doing. No? And yet they're assuming this mantle of moral ascendancy that, they're leading the charge in terms of addressing this problem, when in fact they should be denounced for doing the least compared to what they should be doing. And then the other part, when I was saying it's such a tremendously huge cost, is the fact that the U.S. quite skillfully has managed to insert this clause in the decision part of the text that prevents us from claiming any liability or compensation for loss and damage. So the only thing that you can get is this mechanism that we'll be discussing: risk assessments, insurance systems, another way for corporations to earn from us and our misery, and so on. So there's a lot of things that we are losing in this agreement.
And the fact that the U.S. Cannot get it through Congress means that it could not be legally binding.
That was the big fight over that one last word at that last few hours, when the U.S. wanted to change something from shall to should. And the big difference is that shall means it can be legally binding for them to do all these emissions cuts economy-wide, and should is not legally binding. So that's the whole fight. Yeah, and the 1.5 is there, sure, but also the targets that are enshrined in that agreement through the INDCs are not in fact assuring us of 1.5 limit. It's a 3-degree limit, not a 1.5. So what do we have in the end? We have the most positive things you can do in the end is that there are certain things there that you can potentially use so that you can compensate for the fact that this agreement is failing totally to address climate change and what it should be delivering to people. So it's, in the Philippines, we call it, I don't know how to translate it in English, but it's like the closest is that it's small comfort for what you actually lost. And it's instruments that you can potentially use, but it's not even going to be certain. In the end, what is certain is, with or without this agreement, we can only win if we become strong enough as movements, as people.
I had the feeling that this process is never going to deliver what is needed, and certainly never in time, never at the scale that's needed, never. But perhaps the only thing that's good about it is that it creates a set of rules and processes for international agreements, which, if something else changes because of other people, then they have a mechanism that they can apply to a much bigger change that they have brought about, not the coppers brought about, but they have brought about. For example, if renewable energy suddenly becomes economically much more viable than coal or than the nuclear industry or whatever, and suddenly the investors disinvest from fossil fuels and start to invest in renewables, then there is not only the free-for-all for that, scramble for that, but there are also some international mechanisms that can then be applied to this bigger change. Or is that something you would agree with, or is that too hopeful? Or
we have not been under any illusion that an international agreement will solve everything for us. No illusion that an international agreement will contain everything that we need, nor an illusion that even if it does, it will actually be enforced. But why are we fighting in this arena? First of all, before we look at the positive things, we also have to look realistically at the fact that if we were not fighting, it can be much, much worse. So one of the reasons for fighting in this arena, for engaging on the question of the agreement, is we have to do all we can to prevent it from being the worst it can be. I mean, it's a process where decisions are being made that will affect our lives, our people's lives, in profound ways. So we have to engage to do what we can. On the one hand, to stop the worst from happening, and on the other hand, also to secure some elements that you can use to make yourself stronger in your fight. And that can be processes, structures, that can be actual policies. But when you do engage, you have to demand what it is that governments should be obliged to do, not the least of what you can ask for or what they are prepared to do. Because one of the important reasons why we also engage in this arena is that the only way you build movements and you educate people is if they're involved in a fight that will expose how governments are failing them, a fight that will teach them or allow them to learn what governments are obliged to do for them. So you need to point that out. When we make demands about what kind of an agreement the world needs, it's not because we have any illusions about that. It's because this is what should be. And that's the only way you can empower people to have a critical thinking about the world and governments and policies and corporations, to show them what should be and what they should be fighting for. And that's important because I fear, or I'm worried, that there is a stream in the climate movement that's saying, well, Why are we doing that? This is, it's capitalism is dominating there, and they control the process, and we're not getting anything. We haven't been getting anything. But of course, if it wasn't an arena where the enemy is strong, why should we fight? I mean, if we were controlling it already, there's no reason to campaign. The reason why we fight in there is precisely because that is where our adversaries are trying to do their utmost to bring harm on us. So we fight.
So, Lily, we are all supposed to be human beings. We're supposed to have feelings and eyes and ears, and we can see with climate change that it is not only the people, now we have media that shows us the people. Why are people not changing and seeing the misery of people? They also know that it's not just these people but their children. We're supposed to care about children and grandchildren and the future. We're supposed to be hardwired to care about the continuation of the human species, if nothing else. Why are we so blind? I mean, it's almost like a sort of like being a psychopath, if you like, to not see the harm we're doing to the planet, to ourselves, to our children, grandchildren. Why is there no empathy?
I think there are many reasons. I think for the most part, people do understand what's wrong and what's right. But there are many things that come in the way. One of the things that really prevent people from acting is this idea that they can't do anything. And that's very disempowering, demobilizing. If people begin to think, well, that's the way the world has been and will always be, and we can't really do anything except maybe just look out for ourselves. So it's not that they don't feel, it's this idea that they can't do anything. So that's one of the first we need to address, that there is something we can do and things can change and will change. On the other hand, there's also people who, I guess, also because of their circumstance, they don't even think about whether they can do something or not. They just want to think about themselves and their families because it's more manageable this way. It's too overwhelming to think about the world. I've met a lot of people like that. They would say, oh yeah, I can see what you're saying, but that's really too much for me to take on. So the best thing for me is to make sure my family is okay. So how can it's that, I don't know how to fight that because, there's not even a sense of wanting to do something. It's just a sense of it being too overwhelming. I don't know. And then there are those who actually genuinely believe the counter propaganda that they don't think critically. I saw this in the Facebook, a reaction to a video where I was explaining about what the deal was like and what it meant for our people and so on. And the response was, a lot of us in the Europe will be paying our tax dollars to give money to countries where people don't even care about their environment and whose politicians will just pocket the money. And that's what the propaganda is, and they actually believe it. I don't know where that is coming from at all. I don't know. It's probably the same kind of people who are against immigrants because they're going to take away their jobs and so on. It's just
it
basically.
all seems to be about if people are self-centered or people have some openness. I suppose empathy is the word I would use towards others, not only for yourself and your immediate tribe, if you like, of your family. When are we going to see that our tribe is every human being?
Yeah, but then there's another group of people that are really very conscious that their interest is in maintaining this current system. Their wealth is coming from this system. Their security of their families coming from the system. They have amassed so much so that their thought is they can't afford to lose. They have so much to lose So they would rather, keep the system as it is, maybe tweak it a bit and so on, and not, and deny other parts about it.
So why are you not like this? And why are the other people in the climate justice movement who have met with you, your friends? What has been different that has made? I mean, I have met so many people too, like you say. So what makes you and your friends different?
I think most people who are part of the movement, especially back home, are like that because they have no choice but to fight. No, there's no way to have a better future for their family, their children, their communities, their neighbors, except to resist.
But that's not true for you. You
But
could have
that's
a
not true for me.
comfortable life in a university in America or England or France or somewhere. I mean, you could have a comfortable existence.
Well, then that's where also values kick in. And I'm not saying that values are only true for people who have alternatives also, I mean, even other people who's in a survival situation could also just simply choose to say, I just want to survive for myself and for my family and not mind other things. No. But yeah, I think that's where values would kick in, because I couldn't conceive of living a life that's comfortable for me and not for anyone else.
Where does this sense of the importance of solidarity, importance of compassion, or a bigger sense of the wider world and the need to care for everybody, where does this come from, do you think? What is it? Well, how would you define it, or how would you encourage that in people you speak to?
That's very hard to answer, no? I guess at the end, behind it all, I would say genuine compassion for people. But where does that come from? I don't really know. I don't know. For some people, I guess that's how, it's because how they've been raised, the values that were taught to them, the values taught to them by their family or by religion, or various things. I mean, I think a very common thing about most religions in the world is compassion for others. But I don't know. The end. I think it's very true that in the end, it's what's most important, because even social theories can be proven inadequate or no longer very much applicable because the world has changed too much, or some people get disillusioned because their theories in the end can't explain it all. But for us, we're around, we've been through so much, and we've seen how the world has changed, where visions of how the world should be has also, changed a lot. But I think what's in the end, what really keeps you moving is because of that compassion.
And when you're with people who are really suffering and you see that, does that reinforce for you? Because for me, when I'm here with the COP, I feel, I go in my head, I think, okay, this is good, but this is not so good. And, I can intellectualize it, I can theorize about it. But when I meet you and Ian and the others, and you talk about what happens in the villages, like last night when Ian was talking about it, suddenly I'm there with people. And it's quite different. And when I used to send my One World team members to the south, and they were there, they come back so fired up because they have seen the reality.
I guess that's really one of the most important things. Probably I didn't realize it as much because we've not been in any other situation but close to people. No, I think it really does help reinforce that and sustain us in that. But still, it doesn't necessarily is the one that brings about that compassion. It helps sustain and strengthen. Yeah, but I've also met a lot of people who do choose to side with the poor even without that deep immersion yet, right? And
plenty of corporations who are there who don't feel
who
it.
don't actually
It's-
make that choice.
Exactly.
Yeah.
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 You're right. It's the sustaining and reinvigorating of the values.
Yeah. So
Thank you
It's
so much,
good.
Lydia. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we
well, I guess one of the things that I think is very important is for people to understand that it is a process of building your strength as a movement, as people, and that because it is in the end a question of the balance of strength and the balance of power of the different forces for change and forces against change. I feel it's important to clarify this because I've also seen campaigners who would get depressed, like after Copenhagen, because we didn't win, after they put their everything to it. But you know, at the end of the day, it's not only how good we were or how effective our plans and our methods are, it's also how strong we were at that point in time. And it just simply means then, as well as still now, we're not yet strong enough. So, you know, the only answer is we have to continue to be strong and to strengthen ourselves. We can't give up because we think we did everything already. It's a process. No, it takes time.